In this video, we're going to talk about phonology. Phonology is the study of the sound system of languages. And you've probably, if you've heard of about phonology, you maybe have also heard about phonemes. So since phonology studies the way that sounds work in different languages, phonemes then are the smallest units of sound in any given language. And importantly, they're sounds then that are capable of distinguishing meaning. So for example, in the word bat has three phonemes, b, at. The word cat also has three phonemes, k, at, as does sat, s, at. But you can see here that one phoneme in each of those words has changed from b to k to s, and that changes the meaning of the word. So a phoneme is the smallest unit of sound in a language that changes meaning when that distinguishes meaning, or if we change it, it changes meaning. These are examples of minimal pairs, which means that bat and cat are only differ by one phoneme. Yes, and changing a phoneme changes the meaning, right? Phonemic awareness, then, is the ability to identify and manipulate individual sounds or phonemes in spoken words. And it's something that if you are studying early childhood or elementary education, I imagine that you've been learning about when you think about literacy, because we know how important phonemic awareness is for early literacy development. Here's some examples of what phonemic awareness looks like. The ability to distinguish beginning sounds. So for example, asking a child, what sound does dog begin with? And if that child can hear d, d in dog, they're developing phonemic awareness. Being able to segment a word the way that I did when I was reading the examples, cat into k, at. That's also phonemic awareness. You're able to hear those different phonemes and then blend them together as you make the word cat. Here's another example of segmenting, like in the word shack, sh, ack. So you can see that each letter is not getting its own sound because some phonemes or some letters form one phoneme together. So when we say shack, we're not saying sh, s, ah, right? S and H together form the phoneme sh, just like C and K together form a k phoneme. So you can see that there isn't always direct correspondence between a letter and sound, as sometimes more than one letter can form a single sound. So it really has to do with what we're hearing. Phonology is all about sounds, not about the written script itself. And as I mentioned before about how important it is, this phonemic awareness is for reading, we know that phonemic awareness, developing strong phonemic awareness, is one of the greatest predictors of later reading success. So this ability to hear sounds and distinguish between sounds in different words in a given language is a fundamental building block for future success in reading. There's also, in addition to phonemic awareness, phonological awareness. Now, phonemic awareness, we know, is about hearing the different sounds. Phonological awareness, because it focuses on the spoken language itself, is the ability to hear, recognize, and play with sounds in a particular spoken language. So for example, being able to identify words that rhyme, so even words that might not be spelled the same, but you can hear that they rhyme, like sit, bit, quit, and forget. So hearing that repeated sound, recognizing alliteration, words with the same beginning sound, like this tongue twister, Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. So hearing the repeated across all of those words, identifying syllables in a word as part of phonology. So you're not breaking it down to individual phonemes here, you're breaking it down to the syllables of a word. So in teacher, being able to hear T and chur as two syllables that are part of that word. So that's just a quick overview of what phonology is. Important for our purposes, though, is to understand how phonology corresponds or is connected to second language acquisition. So here's a few things to keep in mind that are challenges for students who are learning English as a new language, or any students who are learning a second language or a third language, engaging with phonology. So first is some sounds used in one language don't exist in another language. So there are sounds that we use in English that don't exist in Korean. There's sounds used in Korean that don't exist in English. And so a challenge with learning a new language is learning sounds that don't exist in the language that you know. This gives just a quick example. So in English, for example, there are many different sounds. Letters can make many different sounds. So the letter A in English can make the sound A as in apple, A as in snake, A as in father, A as in ball, and E as in many. And in Spanish, that same letter just makes one sound, casa, A, which would be the same sound that we hear in father. So there's a correspondence there. And the word snake, the A sound, the sound that the letter A makes in snake is similar to the letter E in Spanish, because the letter E makes an A sound as well. So students who speak Spanish could learn that A makes the sound that they used to attribute to the letter E. But then there's other sounds like the A in apple, the A in ball, and the me in many that don't have a correspondence in Spanish. So being able to produce those different sounds and hear the nuanced difference between those sounds can be tricky for someone who knows Spanish and is learning English. Another tricky thing is that some phonemes in one language are allophones in another language. So let's talk about what that means. So an allophone is a variation of the same sound in a given language. So the example that was given in the right chapter was in English, the word peak is aspirated, which means when we say the letter P, or when we make that sound, there's a puff of air that accompanies it. So if you hold up your hand to your mouth and you say peak, peak, you'll feel that you're producing air. When we say speak, there's no air, it's unaspirated. So you might say, well, it sounds like the same letter, right? But they're slightly different. Peak with a puff of air and peak without a puff of air are allophones. There's no difference in meaning between those two sounds. But in some languages, whether or not there's a puff of air accompanying a sound might mean a difference as big as the difference between cat and bat. And b are phonemes, separate phonemes. But in some languages, the difference between those two sounds, p and p, might be phonemic, might mean a different word that you're producing altogether. So here's one example of this. So in Korean, vowel length differences can be phonemic. So if I stretch, and I don't speak Korean, so I apologize for my pronunciation, but these two words, sida and sida, so depending on how long I stretch that vowel, can actually mean a difference in meaning. So that difference is phonemic. Whereas if we were to stretch apple and apple, it's the same word, right? You don't hear a difference depending on vowel length, but here the difference between vowel length is phonemic. It means I'm changing the meaning of the word. In Japanese, a good example of this is the sounds l and r. In English, l and r are phonemes, right? They are different sounds, and the use of those sounds creates different words. In Japanese, they are allophones. So there's actually a kind of an in-between sound that's called the Japanese R. And because of that, it can be challenging for Japanese speakers learning English to hear the differences between l and r. Differences that for a native English speaker seem really clear, but for someone who doesn't have those separate sounds in their language, where they have an in-between sound, it can be really hard to hear the difference between lot and rot, lay and ray, right and light. So you can see how those words would be challenging to understand if you can't hear the difference between those sounds. And I'm going to put a link to a snippet from a TED Talk that showcases this in a really interesting way, to show how these differences are learned so early. We develop this understanding as babies. We start to pay attention to the sounds that are part of our language, and we start to not pay attention to the sounds that aren't, such that by the time we start speaking, or even before that, we've already developed a sense of the sounds that are in our language and lost some of the ability to hear the sounds that are not in our language. Another challenge is that languages have different rules for how phonemes can occur in a sequence. So those that has to be learned explicitly sometimes when you're learning a new language. So in the book, it talked about how English has certain rules about where vowels and consonants can fall. Consonant, vowel, consonant, consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant, consonant, consonant. So there's different ways that we can put phonemes together that work, and other ways that don't. We would never have a word that is just all consonants, right? Consonant, consonant, consonant. We use vowels in English to be able to make sounds and make words. So in English, for example, we might have the word no, where the KN together makes the N sound, but you would never be able to move that KN to the end of a word like grin, and now KN is represented for that sound. So there's just certain patterns you can use and certain patterns you can't use. And all languages have rules about where phonemes can occur. One rule in Spanish is that words cannot begin with S and a consonant. So that is the reason why there's words like estado, escuela, España, because S followed by a consonant means we have to have a vowel starting that word. And that's one of the reasons why Spanish speakers who are learning English sometimes add a vowel sound to the beginning of a word that in Spanish wouldn't be able to start with an S. So like the word school, you sometimes will hear Spanish speakers say eschool, not just because they're thinking about escuela, which is school in Spanish, but because it's not normal in Spanish, it's to have an S followed by a consonant that isn't preceded by a vowel. All right, so a few takeaways from this video and pathways forward. So languages employ different sounds. They have different rules for how sounds can fit together to make meaning. As we get older, it can be harder to make and hear certain sounds that are not used in the languages that we speak. And so multilingual learners may benefit from some explicit phonemic and phonological awareness instruction. That doesn't mean all of their instruction should be focused on phonemes and phonological awareness, but you can see just from some of the examples I've given that if you're not used to hearing certain sounds, or if you haven't trained your ear and your mouth to hear and make certain sounds, it can be really difficult to distinguish those sounds when you're learning to speak in a new language and when you're learning to read and write in a new language. And so it is helpful to have some comparative instruction, if possible, where the teacher knows something about the home language and knows what might be tricky, at the very least to have some explicit instruction around the different ways that we make sounds in English, and we put sounds together to make words. So knowing that a student, for example, struggles with TH, which is a sound that doesn't exist in many languages, means that they might benefit from some deliberate practice with minimal pairs. So again, words that only differ by one sound, so they can really distinguish between what that sound is. So like thing and ding. So practicing hearing the nuanced difference between the th and the d, that for some students would be as hard to hear as for us would be to really hear differences between things that are not phonemic in English. All right. That's it for phonology. I'll see you in the next video.